Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan. I'm told there's 12 seconds of echo in this room, so you're going to be hearing way more of me than is probably appropriate. I apologize in advance. I'm from a part of Google called the Creative Lab. The Creative Lab is attached to the marketing function of the company, and we have a mandate to explore new ways of using existing technologies with a view, hopefully, to creating new kinds of experiences. And I want to do two things here today. I want to introduce you to one of what I think is the most exciting and mysterious companies around in the world today, certainly in the world of tech, which is called Magic Leap. And I also want to just step back a little bit and survey some of the landscape of VR and AR and look at it particularly through the lens of what it means to become a widespread computing platform, because arguably that's what these things are doing right now. Could we have the next slide, please? So why now? Why do we look at VR and AR now? Who recognizes this device here behind me? There's about 6 hands, 7, maybe 10 hands, which is not surprising. This is a product called the Virtual Boy, which Nintendo put out with some fanfare in 1995, and the product was retired pretty quietly the following year. And it's an interesting sign, I think, of what it means to arrive at a technology very early that perhaps the world isn't ready for. And it's also a sign of just how long the arc of VR in particular goes back. You know, this is a 20-year history, and in fact, when you walk around Silicon Valley today, as I'm lucky to do sometimes, and you speak to people who are operating in the VR space, there's a slight sort of eye-roll-ish quality to their sort of manner. It's like, oh, will it be this time around? But I think you can argue that there's quite a few things aligned at the moment that make this a quite ripe time for VR and AR. VR in particular has a set of devices that are coming out over the next 6 months, probably kicking off next month with an offering by HTC and followed shortly by the Oculus Rift and Sony PlayStation VR in the first half of next year. And that's not even to mention the interesting journey that phone-based VR is on, whether it be Cardboard, which is a kind of VR for everyone prospect, or indeed some of Samsung's work in that space as well with the Gear. And I think AR is at an even earlier stage of its development. You know, we're probably somewhere in the kind of early to mid-90s equivalent sort of time in terms of where it's at in its arc. So I think it's a very exciting place to start the talk today. Next slide, please. How many of you have heard of Magic Leap? Quite a few, maybe half. Okay, that's great. The first thing to say about Magic Leap is that I don't know anything about Magic Leap. Magic Leap is one of the most sort of secretive companies around. They're very interesting, they're very exciting. People sometimes think that people who work at Google might know something about it because we helped lead a funding round of the company in October last year, which involved putting $542 million into one of its first round funding. And to put that in perspective, one of the larger rounds of funding in, for example, Facebook's history was $1.5 billion. So it's an extraordinary investment in what is a very interesting technology, and it will be fascinating to see where it goes. What is it? Well, they've put out a couple of videos on the web. Some of you may have seen them. They are very intriguing. They're very interesting. The company's been around since 2011. They're based in Florida. They have a quite secretive lab there. It's a kind of AR, but it's different to AR that we know. What it is called digital light field technology. So instead of having an AR experience on a screen in front of you, what you are doing is looking out into the real world, and from a corner of what will probably be a set of glasses or similar, although, again, it's very hard to know what exactly they will release, some artificial light is projected onto your retina via a tiny projector at the end of a single optic fiber. That artificial light blends with natural light that is bouncing off the real world to create the impression of virtual objects in front of you. It is an entirely different AR technology to what is out there today. The guy who set it up is a guy called Ronnie Abovitz. He's a very visionary type character, one might say a quite eccentric type character. His TED videos, TED videos, are worth looking up. They are quite entertaining. He actually has a background in medical equipment and sold a very successful company called Mako a couple of years ago to pursue what is his childhood dream, which is Magic Leap. And there are lots of other quirks about the company. They employ one of the world's foremost science fiction writers, a guy called Neil Stephenson, as their chief futurist. And according to Mr. Abovitz, we are at a golden age of machine vision and sensory perception. Do look him up. He has been known to answer questions on various internet forums like Quora.com. He's done Ask Me Anything on Reddit. Both of those forums are worth investigating. There's nothing official out about the company, and all I'm really doing here is reciting what is already in various articles about it, but there's not a lot known. Certainly one to follow, and I commend you to investigating it. Next slide, please. I thought we could just step back a little bit now in the second half and look at where VR and AR are at, the existing technologies that are out there, from the point of view of what it means to become a big computing platform. Because there's a couple of things that sort of need to be in place, arguably more than three, but we'll look at three here today. The first is that you have to have a great user experience. The second is that you need widespread support for the platform that will power your experience. And the third is that you have to have interesting content to go in it. So looking at the first of these, user experience. The first bit of user experience you might call form factor. And one of the things about VR I think that is most distinctive about it is that it is a very obvious form factor. It is a big headset that you put on your head. It is connected to a PC in the case of console-based VR like PlayStation. And there are some wires that are attached to it. It's not a mobile phone, that's for sure. It presents some challenges from a mobility point of view. But you do have this very rich, immersive experience. AR, on the other hand, has almost the opposite problem. AR is not trying to be an immersive environment. AR is trying to be something that is sort of peripheral, if you like, to your real world. Contextual information, peripheral information, and the display of that information is kind of AR's bread and butter. So from a form factor point of view there, what you have to do is think, what kind of compromise are you going to make, right? If you need a PC-based graphics processing unit to power Oculus, for example, that's difficult on a set of eyeglasses. So what compromises are you going to make? Are you going to need a Wi-Fi chip in your AR? Are you going to need Bluetooth? Are you going to need GPS? What kind of battery life do you expect the thing to have? All of these things are quite interesting trade-offs, which it feels like the AR world is still trying to figure out. From an interface point of view, there's also some really interesting stuff, right? So obviously we know how we kind of look around in a VR world, but there's this really interesting problem of lateral movement, right? How do you do it well? And what you see up here in the top middle and on the top right are the Virtuix treadmill. I don't know if any of you have come across this. It's a quite interesting way to literally run when you're not moving. And this thing on the right is a sort of ankle-based sensor that's trying to gauge kind of how your foot's moving in order to navigate the virtual reality space that you're in. And I think it's fascinating looking at these experiments that are out there and thinking, how are we going to deal with that problem that it's very difficult to move around when you have a giant set of opaque goggles on your face. Again, AR has an almost reverse situation, right? There isn't the big interface. Google Glass, which is an experiment we are doing at the moment, has a single button on one of the eyepieces and voice control, right? Now, voice control is at a really interesting stage of its development. And Google is playing in this space, Apple is playing in this space, Microsoft is playing in this space, Facebook's playing in this space. And it is amazing to think that with voice, we are chasing what is a very evolved set of interfaces that we know from touch, right? Steve Jobs famously called our finger the best stylus that was ever invented. And with the combination of years of development for mobile platforms and a beautiful interface with those platforms, you have an extremely powerful user interface in touch. Try and recreate that in voice, and it's a challenge. It's a big challenge. So these are things from a user interface point of view that we have to be figured out. And then, just as a final point on interface, the interesting thing around motion sickness, right? Or VR sickness, as it's sometimes called, which was probably not something anyone ever anticipated. But what you have to deal with in a VR world is what is sometimes called the incongruent sensory inputs, right? Your body is sort of seeing something, and it's not seeing exactly what it would expect to see based on the movement you have. And what's interesting about the latest round of VR devices that will come out next year is that their frame rates are approaching a speed where, in theory, that's less of a problem. But it has beleaguered some of the VR tech that we've seen to date. So it'll be interesting to watch that evolve. From a platform point of view, so this is the second of the 3 points. From a platform point of view, what you need is ease of developing for developers, for your platform, and an ease of distribution and access. And I would argue that this is the area where things are actually going best. It's really amazing to see the work here. Oculus has a fantastically well built out development platform, supports PC and mobile. Cardboard now has SDKs for both iOS and Android. And it really feels like that development environment is becoming much more fluid, much easier to access, and more inviting to developers, which is really important. And from a distribution point of view, obviously the content is distributed in the Oculus device itself. When it comes to Samsung Gear and when it comes to Cardboard, what we have is a massive uptake of web-based distribution, which facilitates those experiences for everyone, right? So YouTube now supports 360-degree video. This thing on the right middle here is a project that our lab did here in Sydney called StorySpheres, which allows anyone to create a 360-degree photograph and add audio to that photograph and upload that to the web instantly, and that will be viewable in any VR-compatible device instantly. So the web is a platform not to be forgotten when it comes to developing for virtual reality. Finally, a quick word on content. I think this is possibly the most open and the most interesting of the questions. What kind of content are we even talking about, right? If you look at the language that's used on the Oculus website, we talk about fun, immersive, engaging experiences. It's kind of the language of games and entertainment. And if you look at what Mr. Abovitz says when he's talking about Magic Leap, he's almost envisaging something a little bit different. He's talking about a new computing platform. It's kind of like we've had PC, we've had mobile, you know, this is what he calls cinematic reality, right? So that's arguably a greater ambition to take on, but possibly very interesting as well in comparison. This thing on the bottom left here is the Ricoh Theta camera. Some of you may know it. It's now available for a couple of $100. It allows anyone to create 360-degree video. It's much cheaper than it was, which is very interesting. So there's this democratization of the toolkit that allows you to create VR content, which is very interesting. And we've sort of already spoken about photospheres, you know, even static content, which are now able to be captured on either Android or iOS cameras. Possibly the most sort of open and, I would say, yet to be determined stuff is alluded to in this bottom right pictures here. Does anyone recognize that still? It's a still from a very, very famous early film from 1896 made by the Lumiere brothers. And it was about 30 seconds long, and it portrayed a train arriving at a station. And famously, the audience who went to see this in the cinema for the first time were so frightened by this train steaming at them on the screen that they got out of their seats and ran out. There was a whole grammar of film, of motion picture film, that has taken 100 years plus to build up. And here we are at the beginning of, you know, truly interactive and immersive content, trying to figure out what that grammar is. Take something as simple as the jump cut, right? In a motion picture film, a jump cut allows an editor to decide exactly where the focus of attention will be as one scene moves to another, right? In a 360-degree film world, that's much harder to replicate, right? Are you always going to jump cut to the same place, no matter where someone was in the previous scene? Or are you going to jump cut to the place, the orientation which they're in? In which case, if there's something interesting going on behind you, how do you direct their attention back behind their head? Do you use a visual cue? Do you use an audio cue? So all these are things which I would sort of bucket in the kind of grammar of interactive film and 360-degree film, which are still being figured out, and it's fascinating to look at the experiments that are out there now. So in conclusion, I think I've possibly raised more questions than I have given answers, but I do think they are interesting questions. VR has a fantastic and interesting heritage in the gaming space, and I suspect gaming will be where a lot of the early development and investment interest sort of rests, but it's really fascinating looking around the hall today at examples in education and health and real estate and other places which obviously the technology can go. And AR, whilst arguably at an earlier stage of its trajectory, possibly has its eyes on a larger prize, although there's lots of big challenges to be overcome as they do that. So with that, I'm going to leave it and hand over back to RMC, but thank you very much for listening.